Hello everyone, in today's video I'll be talking about the second series of Godzilla movies, the Heisei series. After taking a break from Godzilla movies for a decade, this movie goes back to its darker roots, like the first movie. It ignores the previous sequels in the Showa era series. It's like how people did not want to see the 60s campy Batman TV show and wanted a much darker Batman movie in the 80s. Same with Godzilla fans in the 80s. People want to see a much darker Godzilla movie like the original first Godzilla movie. The Return of Godzilla from 1984 is the 16th Godzilla movie in the franchise. This is a follow-up sequel to the first movie, ignoring the Showa-era Godzilla sequels. Godzilla does not fight any big giant monsters in this movie, the first time since the first movie. However, he does fight Super X, a small plane with no wings by the side. Apparently, this movie was originally going to be a remake until they went the sequel route. If this was a remake, it was originally going to be titled The Rebirth of Godzilla. Toho originally wanted Ishiro Honda to direct this movie, but he declined, and he recommended Koji Kishimoto for the directing job. I'm not sure if I said that name right, I apologize in advance. The Japanese Prime Minister did not expect his final term to end on a bad note, where he had to face off against Godzilla, or a possible nuclear war being on the radar. He also wants to make sure he's neutral of both countries rather than favoring one side. He's also worried and concerned with Japan because they've suffered a lot from the past. He wants to make sure the people of Japan will be okay. He gives a good point at the meeting asking both the US and Russian ambassador on if Godzilla would attack Washington or Moscow, would use nuclear weapons knowing that people will be killed if they use nuclear missiles on Godzilla. These words help both parties to not use nuclear weapons on Godzilla. There's a line where he says they wanted to end my term softly. This is one of the rare times in a Godzilla movie where you see a politician was the main character in a Godzilla movie. The Japanese Prime Minister was definitely one of the best characters in this movie, for sure. Godzilla has a little more screen time in this movie than he did in Terror Mechagodzilla. When I was rewatching this movie for this video retrospective, it occurred to me how after seeing so many Godzilla movies from the 60s and 70s, where they were cheesy, campy, goofy, and over the top at times and made for children, you get used to it after a while. For its time, this movie hadn't been the closest Godzilla movie for the time to be in the same spirit as the first Godzilla movie. It was well done, serious again. Also, it got its point into political message like the Cold War where Japan fits in between the US and the Russians in a rut. But after seeing Godzilla -1, I might have changed my mind, which you'll see later in this Godzilla video series. This movie came out around the time when the Cold War was really getting bad and at its worst. Well, we were really getting scared into paranoid, not knowing a possible World War III was going to happen. Not to get political or off topic, think about what happened in recent events 2 years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine. And I hate to be the one saying this, but unfortunately we're back to square one with Russia again, and Russia's our enemy again. Basically, this is a movie that got better with age because of that. As I said before, you get used to it after a while, then it hits you and surprise you like, wow. They really went back to the old darker roots of Godzilla in this movie. No more Godzilla movies being made for kids. This was claustrophobic like the first movie, very intense, stressful at times, dark and brutal. That opening scene when the bug attacks the photographer who finds one missing sailor in the boat was scary, intense, and horrifying. A little shocked too. No one at that time was used to seeing that in a Godzilla movie. It was also interesting to see a scene where you have the Japanese Prime Minister and the US and Russian politicians talking about the possibility of using missiles against Godzilla, especially the Russians, because one of their submarines were attacked by Godzilla, mistakenly thinking that it was the Americans that attacked them. When you watch this scene and analyze it, you can see each politician's different point of view, but at the same time, the wrong thing to do is launch missiles. That could mean the end of the world, and now nuclear missiles are probably far worse than Godzilla, but then again, pick your poison right there. You also see how the Japanese Prime Minister is unsure what to do in this situation, unsure what is the right decision. He's looking at the pros and cons and consequences of nuclear war. In a way, the movie does not pick a side between the US and the Russian politicians. As I said before in my past videos, I was born in 1993. I was born 2 years after the Cold War ended. I can only imagine what that was like to live through that time era and the fear of nuclear war, and the Russians or the US were going to bomb one another, and the possibility of a World War III was going to happen around that time. We see how Japan is built from the first movie and already knowing what to expect from Godzilla, learning from their past mistakes. In the first movie, no one was prepared or expected Godzilla. Japan learned from their past and how to handle Godzilla better this time than they did in the first movie. The characters were very likable, sympathetic, and interesting. These were my second favorite characters in the Godzilla series since the first movie. I was really drawn to these characters. Well, they're not deep or complex characters like the first Godzilla movie, but they're still good characters in their own way. I like the Professor character. He was an example of living through the horrific event from the first Godzilla movie. His reasons and motives for hating Godzilla is because his family were killed when Godzilla attacked Tokyo back in the 1950s. This actor was in a previous Godzilla movie, Ghidorah Three-Headed Monster. They originally wanted Akiko Harada to play this character. This could have been interesting, but sadly died of lung cancer before this movie went into production. I also like the character Onako. I rooted for the entire time to reunite with her brother. When she reunites with her brother, it's a very nice, touching, warm moment. Her brother Hiroshi was also a sympathetic character. He went through a horrible event when he was traumatized for being attacked by a big giant bug on a boat. Goro Maki was a jerk who was trying to write a good story for publicity on Nako reuniting with her brother. He goes from being a sleazy journalist to being a better person later in the movie and becomes a likable character, and he develops feelings for Nako. The Godzilla look design is definitely cool and some of an upgrade from previous Godzilla movies I saw in 60s and 70s Godzilla movies. But of course, the original design is always the best and can't beat that. This is a minor nitpick right here. When you look closely at Godzilla's mouth, you can tell that it's obviously either like a puppet or a guy in a rubber suit, but still, it's great though. Beats CGI. You can debate whether or not the Godzilla effects of this time either hold up or don't hold up sometimes. In my opinion, they hold up just fine. As I'm getting to later Godzilla movies, the Godzilla designs kept getting cooler and better, and upgrades. They did a good job making Godzilla look scary again. They also went back to Godzilla being the villain again, but as I said in my first Godzilla video, is Godzilla the bad guy, or was he misunderstood? On a side note, this actor who played Godzilla in the rubber suit throughout the rest of the Heisei series recently passed away. And what's ironic, around the time of his passing, I was rewatching these Godzilla Heisei series for this video. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but I'll do my best. Rest in peace, Kenbichiro Satsuba. Again, I apologize if I did not say his name right. It was scary when Godzilla was at the nuclear plant. Some security guard saw Godzilla close by him, and he runs away. Can't blame him for that. This was a Godzilla movie for its time that was a breath of fresh air to the franchise. It really goes back to its darker roots, taking itself seriously again. This was not made for kids. Godzilla was not goofy. He wasn't doing victory dances, air kicks. Godzilla was scary again. This was not a B movie. It was serious. Godzilla is a metaphor, once again, on nuclear war. Once again, here's my friend Christian giving his thoughts on the return of Godzilla. And once again, you'll see him throughout the rest of this video giving his thoughts on the rest of the Heisei series Godzilla movies. Take it away.
So, the return of Godzilla, or Godzilla 1985, as it was known here in the States, this is a reboot of the franchise, as well as a direct sequel to the original film, ignoring the continuity of all the films that came in between. Now, this is considered to be the first film of the Heisei Godzilla series, even though technically when this movie came out, Japan was still in its Showa period, because the Heisei period of Japan didn't officially start until I think 1989, so technically speaking, this is a Showa Godzilla film, but because all the sequels to this came out when Japan was in its Heisei period, retroactively, this is considered to be the first of the Heisei Godzilla series, but, Godzilla 1985, or The Return of Godzilla, is a movie that has a very special place in my heart because my grandparents had both this and King Kong vs. Godzilla on VHS, and I would watch this movie all the time when I was over their house. Like, this was actually my second Godzilla movie, and for the longest time, I used to think that this was probably the best Godzilla movie since the original, but then -1 came out, and I do think -1 is probably a better film than this, but compared to a lot of the other Godzilla movies, this really does harken back to the original film, where it's making a commentary, again, on the dangers of nuclear annihilation, and you could tell this film was very much commentating on the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, which were kind of at their peak in the 1980s, even though today we're still not exactly friends with Russia. But yeah, I really, really like this one a lot. I like the characters in this. I actually think the Prime Minister is a really sympathetic character, and Godzilla is genuinely pretty scary in this one. Now, if you can, watch the original Japanese cut, but I actually don't mind the American cut, Godzilla 1985, even though that one does, the way it's re-edited, they make the Russians out to be more like the outright bad guys, whereas in the Japanese cut, they were kind of trying to, show both sides of that conflict a little bit. But, yeah, I recommend this movie. Whichever cut you see, I do recommend this one.
Before I move on to Godzilla vs. Biollante, here are my thoughts on the American cut, Godzilla 1985. As I said before, despite only talking about Japanese Godzilla cuts for these videos, this one I'm breaking the rules and making an exception right here. Godzilla 1985 is a sequel to Godzilla King of the Monsters from 1956. Just like the first Godzilla movie, I did not realize the two different cuts and only thought there was only one version of this cut of this movie. I saw the Japanese cut first on DVD and was a little confused, asked myself, where's Raymond Burr? My friend Christian told me the story behind that. He lent me the Godzilla 1985 American cut on VHS tape and told me that this movie has never been released on DVD/Blu-ray because of legal rights issues. Then it all clicked in, and I understood. Even though you can't get this movie on Blu-ray DVD, you can watch it on YouTube, but who knows how much longer this movie will be on YouTube for, and you can also get this on VHS tape. Also, another option is to get this movie at conventions on a bootleg. Just like the first Godzilla movie, this movie was distributed in America by New World Pictures, re-edited, dubbed it, and added new scenes with Raymond Burr. The Japanese cut is called The Return of Godzilla. The American version is called Godzilla 1985. Also, the Japanese cut was not released on DVD or Blu-ray until 2016. It's true they say, history does have a weird way of repeating itself sometimes. This movie did not do well when it came out in America in 1985, but has since then gained a cult following in recent years. Part of the reason is why because American audience at the time, no one was used to seeing the darker Godzilla movies, at the time when they were used to Godzilla fighting big giant monsters and the comedy in the previous Godzilla movies from the 60s and 70s. Just like Godzilla King of the Monsters, it was a little distracting with the jump cuts. They cut out the important scenes from the Japanese cut that are not in this movie. In the Japanese cut, they had a scene where the Russian soldier was trying to stop a missile being launched at Godzilla. In this American cut, they make it look like he did launch the missile on purpose. They basically made the Russians into the bad guys in this American cut when you think about it. I'm not sure because of the Cold War at the time with the US and the Soviet Union, but I could be thinking too deep into that. In the Japanese cut, the Russians were neutral, not the bad guys. But unlike King of the Monsters, Raymond Burr was not standing next to a body double. It's not re-edited. He's not sharing any scenes with body double Japanese actors. The Japanese cut is better, but this one is alright. Again, just like the first Godzilla movie, once you've seen the Japanese cut, you can't go back to the Raymond Burr version. No disrespect to Raymond Burr, he was a great actor. As I said before, Raymond Burr does do a good job in this movie. He reprises his role as Steve Martin from the first movie. But around this time, actor-comedian Steve Martin was big and popular, so in this movie he's referred to as Mr. Martin instead. There was a scene I did like where we see Mr. Martin as having a bad dream from the American cut, how he's still traumatized from those events in the first movie. When Godzilla comes back, he's brought back in as a consultant because of his experience in the past against Godzilla. They don't explain why he has this dragon statue. They originally wanted the American cut to be a comedy, but Raymond Burr refused to do this movie. This movie was being done as a comedy. While Raymond Burr does do a good job in this movie, the minor characters are bland and forgetful and not interesting or compelling. They're also a little bit comedic at times. It's like they were trying too hard to add a little humor to lighten the movie up a little bit, which doesn't make any sense. Also, this movie has the soda Dr. Pepper as a product placement in the background, this American cut, because Dr. Pepper sponsored this movie when it came out back in 1985. Seeing this minor character, whether he was like a lieutenant or a major, seeing him drink the Dr. Pepper looks like something out of a commercial. At the end of this movie, Mr. Martin gives a great speech in the end of this movie. I won't recite it, go give it a watch and be surprised and be amazed. The American cut is not bad, it just doesn't have the same value as the Japanese cut, but it was still not that bad. It's just okay, decent. If I was going to rewatch this movie, I'm going to go with the Japanese cut, but that's just me. Again, respect to anyone who likes and prefers either cut to this movie. And also, I mentioned Dr. Pepper. What do you know? I got a Dr. Pepper right here. How did I not realize that? Kudos. I'm not sponsored by Dr. Pepper. And believe it or not, this is my first Dr. Pepper in over 20 years. I am not joking. Godzilla vs. Biollante from 1989. The 17th Godzilla movie in the franchise. It's the second Godzilla movie in the Heisei series. This one was a unique original Godzilla movie. It was a follow-up sequel to Godzilla 1984. Despite being a follow-up sequel to Return of Godzilla, it feels like its own movie. No recurring characters from the last movie are in this movie, but they do make some references from the last movie. They mention a new Super X from the last movie this time. It's Super X2. Supposedly Super X2 is an improvement from the last one, but we all know what happens. Godzilla destroys it. Who are we kidding? It also opens a little recap from the last movie, The Return of Godzilla, where we last saw Godzilla fall into a volcano to his death. James Rolfe said it well, saying this movie is like Godzilla vs. Little Shop of Horrors. Believe it or not, this concept and original story idea was won in a contest written by a dentist. I guess Toho likes to have writing competitions to see who really comes up with a new original Godzilla movie idea. It's similar to the person who won the competition on Jet Jaguar. Biollante is one of the most original, unique Godzilla villains ever. First, she looked like a rose, then she transformed into a giant monster vegetable later in this movie when she fights Godzilla. I like the characters in this movie, they were very good. This scientist who lost his daughter in a terrorist attack had her cells inside of Biollante. The soul of his daughter inside Biollante reminded me of Hammer's Frankenstein-created woman, where Frankenstein wanted to bring the souls back to life. Basically, he's messed up, was never the same person after his daughter Erica died. He does redeem himself at the end of this movie, where he learns from his scientific mistake. His character is basically the Dr. Frankenstein in this movie because he created Biollante. It was understanding why he wanted to bring his daughter back, but it was probably not a good idea to bring her soul back and a giant plant monster. You can say this was extreme, that he went too far with this when you think about it. Not only was Godzilla fighting another monster, he was fighting a combination of a human cell, a plant rose cell, which the scientist's daughter was inside of, and Godzilla's cell into one. Godzilla was semi-fighting himself to a certain degree when you think about it. He gives a good point on how did Godzilla fight Biollante because his soul is inside Biollante. It's hinted that Godzilla had psychic abilities, knowing when Biollante would show up and attack the city anytime soon. This movie is a spiritual film, which is something I've never seen in a Godzilla movie before, as I continue my Godzilla journey. I'm not a scientist, but this movie is very heavy on the science of bioengineering. It was realistic, showing what would happen if any government was trying to steal and get Godzilla's DNA and make it into a weapon. In a way, it goes back to the first movie to some degree, but again, not too extreme. Also, like the first Godzilla movie, it's about the human characters. The monsters are metaphors. The scientists are the monsters are misunderstood. This movie had a Frankenstein tone to it. Another example of science going too far, how science can be very complicated and confusing. It's also another example of what happens when a man tries to play God. It even has a little ghost story too about the existence of the afterlife and the soul of the human body. Miki has the psychic abilities communicating with Godzilla. She was a recurring character throughout the rest of the Heisei series. She only has a small part in this movie. She works at some institution with children, and they draw a picture of Godzilla knowing that he'll be back anytime soon in the near future. The character Gondo, who was one of the soldiers, was like an action hero with his cheesy one-liners. This movie has cool special effects when you see the military attack Godzilla, and when Godzilla and Biollante fight, but they only have 2 fight scenes. Biollante squirts like this, spit acid at Godzilla. It's like so disgusting. I don't even know what the heck that was that he spits on Godzilla. This movie has some of the best beautiful visuals in a Godzilla series. Seeing Biollante's shots of the growth phases throughout the entire movie. Little fact right here, horror filmmaker John Carpenter had a small Godzilla statue design of this movie in his office. From this point on in the 90s, Godzilla movies were hard to find on VHS tape, and people would have to order them through catalogs or get them on bootlegs at conventions. No matter how crazy or weird or confusing this movie sounds, it's a must-see for Godzilla fans. It's one of the best Godzilla movies in the series, and definitely one of my favorite Godzilla movies. Also, if someone asked me the premise of this movie, The only thing I can say is go watch and see for yourself to believe it. That's all I can say.
So, Godzilla vs. Biollante, I fucking love this movie, and this is one of the most visually beautiful Godzilla films ever made, in my opinion. The effects are actually pretty masterful in this movie, and again, it's just a visually beautiful film. I also like this combination of science fiction with kind of like this mysticism or like this metaphysical aspect where it turns out Biollante is actually possessed by the spirit of the daughter of the scientist who made Biollante. Like, it's such a weird premise, but it works. Like, this feels like a weird mix between a ghost story, a movie about the dangers of genetic engineering, and a Godzilla movie. But yeah, this is a really good one. I definitely recommend Godzilla vs. Biollante.
Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah from 1991, the 18th Godzilla movie in the franchise, the third one in the Godzilla Heisei series. Despite this movie came out in 1991 in Japan, it was not released in the US until the late 90s direct-to-home video. This is once again a follow-up sequel to the first two Godzilla movies in the Heisei series. They were very consistent so far in the continuity. It was a time travel movie where the characters, Miki Terazawa, an author, and Professor Shindo, a dinosaur expert who fought in World War II, they go back in time with UFO aliens from the 23rd century to prevent Godzilla existing. When I first saw this movie a couple of years ago, when I finally got Godzilla movies on DVDs, I didn't like this one at first. I found it boring. My complaint was not much Godzilla in this movie. I know it's very shallow nitpicking me to say that, because the original first Godzilla movie, he was not in that much, not the main focus. He was a metaphor. Rewatching this movie for this video, I was a little bit less harsh on this movie. I'm not sure if it's one of my favorite Godzilla movies. It had some interesting ideas and cool scenes of King Ghidorah destroying buildings, cool awesome battle scenes of Godzilla and King Ghidorah fighting each other. Not only does Godzilla fight King Ghidorah, he fights a robot version of King Ghidorah called Mecha King Ghidorah. That was pretty cool and awesome and original right there, and a nice change-up. King Ghidorah's design looks about the same as in the original Showa-era Godzilla series. The android robot reminded me of a combo between Ash from Alien, Data from Star Trek The Next Generation, and the Terminator. You can tell they were copying Terminator a little bit from this movie, basically Toho's version of Terminator. When the android's car crashes, get on fire, he comes out, his body is burned, and his skin is off, just like Terminator. At first he was a bad guy, then he's reprogrammed to be a good guy again. So Terminator right there when you think about it. When they altered the timeline history, it also reminded me of Back to the Future Part 2. It also a little bit of Star Trek to some degree, again, time travel. What does not make any sense, why is it when histories alter, people seem to know and remember who Godzilla is? It seems like the main characters could not make up their mind they wanted to get rid of Godzilla or bring him back. When Godzilla comes back, being created again, he's more powerful, indestructible than the old Godzilla. Not only is Godzilla origin story altered in this movie, they also altered King Ghidorah's origin story in this movie. In the original series, he was an alien who came from outer space with no explanation. In this movie, he is created by the villains of this movie. It's an interesting change-up. I can see why some fans may not gravitate towards these new reinventions of Godzilla King Ghidorah's origin story. In the original Godzilla movie, he was mutated by nuclear radiation. In this movie, it's King Ghidorah who was mutated, created by the scientists. Godzilla started in this movie as the villain, and then later becomes the anti-hero in this movie. King Ghidorah was the opposite. He was the anti-hero at the beginning of this movie, and then he becomes the villain throughout the later in the film. It's funny when they go back in time, some US soldiers spotted the UFO thinking it's a shooting star, and one of the soldiers' name is Major Spielberg. I'm not sure if that was intentional, paying homage to Steven Spielberg. At first, Major Spielberg thought he wanted to report it, but the other guy tells him, keep it a secret, tell your grandson about it someday. What the story, Mark? The dome art that the UFO aliens left behind in the past that altered the timeline history look like the Mogwais from Gremlins. What a strange combination of this Godzilla movie ripped off from other films. There's this character named Shenada who was a World War II vet, claims dinosaurs saved his life, and after Godzilla destroys his architect buildings he created that made him a millionaire, he decides to die in one of his own buildings he designed. I guess he figured, well, the other dinosaur Godzilla saved his life. Now he wants to be killed by the alternate Godzilla. I guess he figured, what the heck, go out with a bang. The character Terazawa was a writer currently writing a book on Godzilla. He was a likable character, very sympathetic. It was funny when he asked Emmy, one of the characters who come from the future, asking her, was my book a bestseller? She says no one knew about his book. The look on his face was priceless, but disappointment was funny and hilarious. Also, spoiler right here, as it turns out, she was the great-granddaughter of Terazawa. Emmy was a good character. At first, she was on the villain's side, but once she finds out the real plans and how they're going too far, she turns to the good side. It was also nice to see Mick again from Godzilla vs. Biollante in this movie. It was very interesting how they altered Godzilla's origin story. When we first saw Godzilla in this movie, a different alternate version of Godzilla, he looked nothing like Godzilla from the original movie, or in this movie's version we see throughout the rest of the film. They don't explain this was a pre-Godzilla 1954. It begs the question, would this be considered a semi-prequel to the first Godzilla movie? Does that also mean the last two Godzilla movies' history was erased and never happened? The movie is considered by Godzilla fans to be patriotic. That war scene between the Japanese soldiers versus the US soldiers during World War II was considered a little controversial at the time when this movie was distributed in America around the time. It was also considered controversial at the time because of a speech that Shindo gives to his soldiers saying that we will beat the Americans and we will show the Americans how strong we are. When I rewatched this movie, like I said before in my previous Godzilla videos, they used to show some of the 90s and 2000 Godzilla movies on cable TV, either on Sci-Fi or HBO, I don't remember exactly. I also mentioned how I don't have a photographic memory of which ones I saw as a little kid. But for one, this is a Godzilla movie I semi-remembered, but as a kid I ignored and did not pay attention to the time travel part and alternate history timeline. I only remember a certain Godzilla fighting King Ghidorah as a robot and a girl controlling the robot King Ghidorah. After Godzilla is defeated, he's underwater and he comes back to life. The end. It has a lot of confusing subplots that don't add up at times, and the concept of this movie can be considered a little bit silly at times and a little bit messy at times. It was also a little bit lighter than the first two Godzilla movie Heisei series, but at the same time, this movie's not a horrible movie. Just not one of my favorite Godzilla movies, but that's just me.
So I think my issue with Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is, you can tell this one is trying to gear it a little more towards children, and it's definitely a lot more cheesy than the first two Heisei Godzilla films, because Godzilla 1985 and Godzilla vs. Biollante really did try to return Godzilla to his darker roots, where both those films were actually more like horror films in a way, and were actually trying to make serious political commentaries. And this one does have a lot of social commentary in it, but again, it's a lot cheesier and a lot more, I don't want to say comedic, but it's definitely a lot more lighthearted than the first two Heisei Godzilla films, and that is my main issue with the Heisei series, is kind of like the Showa series. It starts off serious, but eventually gets goofy again, and but I do like this one. I actually like this one quite a bit. I like the new origin for King Ghidorah, that he's a creature created by time travel, and even though the time travel elements of the film create a lot of freaking plot holes, this is a good one, and I definitely recommend it.
Godzilla vs. Mothra from 1992, the 19th Godzilla movie in the franchise, the 4th Godzilla movie in the Heisei series. This one is a remake to the original 1964 Mothra vs. Godzilla. When the US distributed this movie, it was called Godzilla and Mothra: The Battle for Earth. Believe it or not, this one is considered to be the highest grossing Godzilla movie to date. This is a movie I can see previous past Godzilla fans' generation not liking this movie because the old one was nostalgia for them. Whereas the 80s and 90s Godzilla fans liked this one for being nostalgic. Each Godzilla fan grew with a different version of this movie when Godzilla fought Mothra. It's like similar how with Stephen King's It miniseries versus the 2017-2019 It remakes. I know that some previous generations grew up on the book and the miniseries don't seem like the modern day It remakes that much for a particular reason. The opening scene we are introduced to our main characters like Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade. He finds some ancient artifact, gets out alive, surviving booby traps, then he's arrested, but given a second chance to help a group of scientists to figure out a meteorite that was hit on Earth. Our main character was married and has a daughter with his ex-wife. He failed to pay the last child support. Despite his marriage fell apart, when they tried to stop Godzilla in a weird way, it helped fix and improve their relationship. I know, a little predictable and a little cliche when you think about it. Their daughter was cute and adorable. She was a lot smarter than they realized. She wanted to make sure her dad learned an important lesson not to steal. It's a cute, touching moment when she sees her dad for the first time in a long time. This was basically a family film mixed with fantasy and comedy blend in. I can agree, these characters are very cliched. Mickey comes back, but again, her part is so small, they could have cut her out in this movie, and it would not have any effect on the plot whatsoever. Again, good character from the first 3 movies. They don't give her much to do in this movie. It's like she was thrown at the last minute, only used for her psychic abilities for Godzilla. I get it, that's her character's arc, but at least in the last 3 movies, she had a lot more to do and offer. When I was watching this movie, it occurred to me how even though this is a remake, but it's not shot for shot, they copy some certain scenes. Like, for example, when the greedy businessmen are not listening, kidnapping the twin fairies, thinking they'll make a profit over them, and then one of the greedy business partner employees, I don't remember his name, but honestly, the point is, he kidnaps him, then he redeems himself and learns from his mistake. This actor right here are going to be in a few later Godzilla Millennium series movies, which I'll talk about later. This movie also goes back to the original themes about how the twin fairies have lost faith in humanity, thinking that all people are bad and corrupted. Once they meet the group of scientists, their faith in humanity is trusted again. The twin fairies don't care about fame or money, they just want Mothra back on the island where he belongs. The look of Mothra is pretty good. It's a slight update for the 90s, but Mothra looks the same as the original one. For what I've understood with Godzilla and Mothra fans of this movie is that only the last movie where they changed up King Ghidorah's origin story, they kept Mothra's original origin story the same spirit as the original Mothra movie. I like Ghidorah, the demon evil version of Mothra. That was really cool and original. Too bad we haven't seen this monster in other kaiju movies. I can see so much potential in this character in like a future like other Godzilla vs. Mothra movie. You'll remember my Godzilla Showa era video, I mentioned that I like the twin fairies played by the Peanuts. These new twin fairy actresses played by Kiko Imurara and Sayaka Asawa. I'm probably saying their names wrong, I apologize for that. They're just alright, they're not bad, they're not the same as the Peanuts. As personal preference, I like the Peanuts as the twin fairies. This is another movie on how humans are doing damage to the environment, that we should be taking care of better of our environment. This is another business versus environmental protection kind of movie, just like the original. This movie can basically look like something out of a Captain Planet episode, especially how Captain Planet was very big in the 90s. Despite the environmental movement been around since the 1960s, in the 90s it was an important issue. I remember being a little kid in the late 90s, the cartoons I used to watch or other kids' movies would have commercials on how to raise awareness of the environment and how to save the rainforest. The cartoon movie Ferngully is one example. Ashiro Hano would visit the set during the making of this movie before his passing 1 year later. This Godzilla movie has some of the best visual fight scenes in a Godzilla movie. Very stunning imagery. It has a great final showdown fight scene between Godzilla, Mothra, and Ghidorah. Really cool and epic. After this movie's success, Toho did a reboot to Mothra called The Rebirth of Mothra. I have these movies on DVD, but I haven't seen those yet. I know they're on Blu-ray with the Mothra reboot trilogy. As a personal preference, I still like the original Mothra vs. Godzilla movie from 1964. But at the same time, I thought this was an okay, decent, solid one. It was a fun one. I can see myself going back to rewatch this one on rare occasions if I'm in the mood. Also, it was not a shot-for-shot remake. It was a spiritual tribute remake to the original one.
So, Godzilla and Mothra, The Battle for Earth, or Godzilla vs. Mothra, whichever title you want to refer to it as. This one I do enjoy. This used to be like my least favorite film of the Heisei series, but I've definitely warmed up to this one over the years. This one is definitely more of a comedy and more of a family film compared to the first 3 Heisei Godzilla films, but it's not bad. I mean, it's cheesy as hell, but It is an endearing movie, though, and I definitely recommend it. I will say the environmentalist message of the film, while I agree with it, it is very ham-fisted and is very corny in the movie. It's a corny movie, but I do like this one, and I also think the effects work in the film is actually really good. Mothra and Batra look freaking great in this movie, and what the fuck was I gonna say? And I think it's interesting that this is more of a Mothra movie than it is a Godzilla movie. This is more of a Mothra film that Godzilla just happens to appear in, which might be a problem for some people, but it doesn't really bother me that much.